buy your textbook at the bookstore. If you did, the cover's going to look like this because it's a soft cover, and that saves actually a reasonable amount of money versus a hard cover. Okay, so this is what we call a special edition because we ordered it ourselves. And so it's going to look a little different than that slide I showed at the 7th edition. So this will work just fine. Many of you still have it in a plastic wrap. You don't want to open it because you're not sure. I've had quite a few emails to this effect, so I thought I took a picture of one of your colleagues' books and we just made it into a slide. Okay, the answer is that. If you're taking a little time to get your textbook, or someone said they're out of them already? Yeah. Really? I don't know how that happens because we give them our estimation and I went to look to see how many they had. So, how many of you bought two? Come on now. So I know they're on back order. I have a copy in the library at the reserve desk. Okay, so you can go check it out for, I think it's a 4-hour period. It has to stay in the library. And that will give you access to the textbook while you're trying to figure out what to do. Okay? If that's becoming a log jam, I've got a couple other copies. I can go add a couple of more reserve copies there for you to have access to. Okay? Next important thing. What did 0 say to 8? What did 0 say to 8? Nice belt. Nice belt. Good job. How about this one? Yeah, I told you guys that my kids made a lot of these, right? Sometimes I get them out of these magazines, and sometimes I make them up. Usually you can tell which one they came from. What movie did the pirate watch? One that was rated R. All right. So I have a sneaking suspicion we just start here. This is a big giant sign on my screen. So last time I looked, there were about 150 respondents on Doodle Poll. I had a lot of you email me, not a lot, but a few email me saying it wasn't working. And then a lot of times when I emailed you back, copy and paste it to your browser, then it worked. So if you haven't done it yet, I want to encourage you, go ahead and do that now on your device. Go to that Doodle Poll. And if it's not working on your browser, maybe open a different browser and just copy and paste it into that web browser. I don't know why sometimes the link works and sometimes it doesn't, but 150 plus of you have actually been successful. So I know it does work. It's probably something with your settings in your device or your browser. Our SIs have to leave rapidly after this class to go sign up for a classroom based upon the top time slots in the Doodle Poll. So it's pretty important that we do this. All right, so we're going to finish up our lecture from Tuesday, and then we'll dive into chemistry of life. At this point, you really should have read chapter 1. And you should have read chapter 2, because that's what we're going to talk about today. If you didn't, when we get to chapter 2, the good news is it's mostly review. But the bad news is you might realize very quickly where the rough spots are. And that's why I want you to read. So if you're not going to stay up on the reading, then don't bother buying the textbook. But don't expect to do extremely well in the class. Okay? If you're not doing the work before you show up, it's going to be tough to stay on top of it. All right? So Tuesday's lecture is already posted on YouTube. And so it may not always be that quick, but it's early in the semester, so it's easier for me to stay on top of it now than maybe mid-semester. But this is where we need to pick up. We need to pick up with how these body systems that we left off with are interdependent, meaning that they interact with each other. So there isn't a single body system in the body that is isolated from everybody else. All of them actually influence one another at some degree, some more so than others. So the easiest two systems that you're going to see next semester in 202 that play off of each other pretty aggressively is the cardiovascular system. All right? So it's the vascular network, including the heart, and the respiratory system. So that those two systems actually are very intimately connected. You need to have a heart and a blood vessel system to pump blood through the body, but you need to be able to oxygenate it. You need to be able to expire CO2, so it has to be connected to the respiratory system. So if the heart's beating and the lungs aren't inflating and deflating, then neither system is actually going to work for very long. Okay? The nervous system requires oxygen to stay alive, like most systems do. So the nervous system is going to need oxygenation. Most oftentimes that comes with blood flow. The skin. The skin will slough off and it'll become necrotic and just go away if it's not perfused with oxygen. In fact, the outer layer of the skin is avascular, and that's the reason it actually sloughs off. And you know that's true because you can sit there and scratch it and see it kind of flake. Okay? So that's one of the strategies the body's using, and we'll see that in the integument system, is the tissue that's further away from the blood supply starts to die. And then it sloughs off, and the stuff underneath rejuvenates it. So all these systems are interdependent. They rely on each other. Homeostasis ends up maintaining what we call a stable condition. That's what goes in this blank. A stable condition is not to be confused with unchanging. It's stable, but it's not static or unchanging. And we usually maintain this by what we call feedback loops. So feedback loops are ones where, like this thermostat example that's shown on the screen, in your apartment, your dorm room, or your house, you have a thermostat. And you set it to some comfortable temperature at 68, for example. And in the wintertime, when the temperature falls below that set point, it kicks the furnace to be turned on. Right? And then the furnace turns on, and it heats it up to some set point, and then it turns off. And then it cools off again, and it kicks on, so on and so forth. So you have this homeostatic environment of your living room or your bedroom that is maintained by some feedback loop. Okay? And in this situation, this is an example of a negative feedback loop. And that negative feedback loop is one of the most common feedback loops that we have in the body. And you can see just another pictorial of how this feedback loop works. So we're going to look at another one. Everybody stand up. Stretch out. Coach Keller is on stage. We're going to take our pulse right now, okay? Find your pulse. We're going to take it for 15 seconds. Just relax. Think about butterflies or, clear blue skies or fresh powder that you're cruising down. Ready, set, go. Stop. Multiply that number by 4. You can use your phone. We're in biology. Okay, write that number down or memorize it. Okay? So that's considered a resting heart rate. It would have been a little bit lower if you would have been sitting in your chair, right? But not much. Okay? Plus, maybe you got a little nervous because I had a whistle on. So maybe it ramped up just a tad. Okay? So now we're going to have to spread out because there's like 400 and this is going to sound like elephants. We're going to run in place. Are you ready? I'm dead serious. I'm dead serious. Ready, set, go. This has nothing to do with the lecture. It's just fun. Only that. That's awesome. Keep going. We have about another 40 minutes. Keep going. Someone falls over, pick him up. Alright, we're going to take our pulse here in a second. You guys ready? Not yet, wait for it. All right. Stop. Multiply by 4. Write it down. You guys look good. Awesome. Everybody awake now? Yeah, I should have waited an hour before we did that. Is that number higher or lower? Higher. So what were some baseline numbers? Let's shout them out.
92.
92 baseline, okay?
66.
66. Someone's barely awake, okay? What's that, 80? 88? Anybody lower than 66? What was it? 60.
56.
56. Ooh, look at that. Like cold water over there. Huh? 52. Goodness. All right, look at these athletes. All right, what about your exercise rate? What was that? 126. Okay. Anybody else? 126. 104.
108.
112.
108.
96. Okay.
88.
88. That was your exercise? 88. Wow. I saw you weren't actually really running. This doesn't count. Okay. Do it again. No, I'm just kidding. Was that? Do it again? Waste more time, Kelly. All right. You guys relaxed and calm down?
Yeah.
Let's take it one more time now. Ready? Go. Stop. Where is it now? Times 15. Or times 4, excuse me. I know. Did it drop pretty quick? We were like at the 120s, minus the outlier that we would kick that data out. 120s. Now where is it at? 56. 48. 104? You're still nervous, dude. No more running, don't worry. Promise. No more running. Right? Yeah. Don't wear flip-flops to class, right? Otherwise gonna make you jog. Anybody else? What was the recovery? 75. Okay, 84. So the point of this exercise is for you to see that this was a negative feedback system on heart rate. Right? So your body is triggering an activity, and it's going to upregulate your heart rate in order to increase perfusion to tissues. And when that demand goes away, the heart slows down, and you get to go back to sleep. Right? So this is much of how the body operates, is with these feedback loops. Right? So this is just the activity that we did. If we take a look at examples of negative feedback loops, what are some other examples that we can see in the body of negative feedback loops? Temperature, that's a great one. pH, another great one. Oxygen levels, very good. Okay, if your oxygenation is low, you're probably going to take some deep breaths. Likewise, if your pH is too acidic, you're going to increase respiration. You're going to hyperventilate, blow off more CO2. What else? Blood pressure. Okay. What else? I heard something over here. Glucose levels. Absolutely. Glucose levels get too low, stimulates appetite. You get hungry. You might get thirsty as well. Right? You might be lethargic because your body's saying, I'm going to slow down my metabolic use of energy until I receive more calories. Okay, so you're going to compensate for that. What else? Calcium, another great one that we're going to talk about this semester. Calcium homeostasis is absolutely regulated in a negative feedback manner. If you have too low calcium in your bloodstream, you're going to do things, you're going to release hormones so that you minimize the amount of calcium that you excrete out of your urine and in your stool. You're also going to increase the amount of calcium you absorb out of the gut, out of your food. Okay? You're also going to free up calcium by taking it from bones. We'll talk about that more. And then the reverse is true. If you have too much calcium, you'll build more bones, or you'll excrete it in the urine if you don't need it. So these are all great examples of negative feedback. Hydration levels. All right, if you're thirsty, you're going to trigger a thirst response to go get a drink of water. So these negative feedback loops, the response or the result to the problem state, or what triggered it, is in the opposite direction. So for example, if you're hot, you're going to sweat and you're going to vasodilate. Vasodilation means the blood vessels get bigger. More blood goes to that tissue. Therefore, you have more fluid in order to take away heat. You remove the heat by sending the hot liquid to the surface, and you lose it through convection, through conduction, and mostly through evaporation. And that's one of the reasons that when you exercise in a drier environment, it's a lot more comfortable than a humid environment, because your efficiency of losing heat via evaporative heat loss is more effective in a dry environment than a humid environment. If you're cold, you're going to do the opposite, right? You're going to start a shiver response, and you're going to vasoconstrict. Vasoconstriction is those blood vessels get smaller, and in so doing, you restrict hot, warm blood from moving to the extremities and losing heat, and you conserve it in the core. So if you're very, very cold, you might find that your hands and your feet are super, super cold, because you're putting the body heat to the core where the core organs are. So you're actually shunting blood towards those critical organs. Now, a way that we would look at this on a test question might look like this. Homeostatic regulation of the body is made possible through the coordination of all body systems. This coordination is controlled mainly by what and what? So skeletal and excretory systems, respiratory and reproductive, nervous and endocrine, or circulatory and digestive? C. C is the correct answer. So to flesh this out a little bit more, the nervous system is very good about triggering a response very quick. Very, very quick. The endocrine system uses hormones. Now, hormones don't happen quite as fast, but they're actually more broad-reaching. So nervous system is very specific. You can actually stimulate a very specific area. Whereas the endocrine system, you send out the signal, and the entire body is getting that signal in the bloodstream. So when you think about things that are under nervous system control, like reflexes, they happen very fast. Right? You touch a hot stove and you retract. If you think about other things that are, the entire organism is going through a change, and you're using it using hormonal control, like growth, like the pituitary gland, and releasing endocrine signals in order to stimulate growth of skeletal muscle, of the bones, right, of the cartilage, of the connective tissue. You're not just going to say, let's just grow the muscles today, and then we'll grow the bones next. You're going to grow everything all at the same time. And it's going to happen a little bit more slowly and more systematically. So negative feedback loops are the most common. The other category are positive feedback loops. And they're also very important for the survival of the organism, but they're for different purposes. So the response to our trigger or the problem state, I'd rather say trigger or the stimulus, because it's not really a problem per se, but it's something that the organism is responding to. So the response to the trigger or the response to the problem state is in the same direction, or it's heightened. It's increased. So the example would be, if you had too little water levels, hydration levels were low, that you would continue in this deprivation mode of not getting water. Or if your calcium was too low, you would still lose more and more calcium. That's not a good example for what you would want here. So that's actually managed by negative feedback loops. Things that are positive feedback loops are going to be things that are more rare in occurrence. And you want an explosive response. You want a response to be much bigger than what it was originally intended to be from the beginning. So for example, childbirth, labor itself, right? So a little contraction stimulates a positive feedback loop to give larger contractions so that delivery is actually possible. Orgasm, another really important one. Isn't it a good idea that it wasn't negative feedback loop? Now we're kind of saying, just saying. Okay, so orgasm is an example of a positive feedback loop, but you'll never forget it now, right? Kind of goes hand in hand with childbirth, just in case you're curious. The menstrual cycle in females, also a positive feedback loop example. Okay, it continues to build over a 28-day cycle. Some other ones, blood clotting. Blood clotting. So the coagulation cascade is a process by which, when the blood is triggered to coagulate and turn into a solid material, you don't want it to kind of get part way and then back off. You don't want it to be really slow. Okay? You want it to be aggressive and fast because you're trying to theoretically save the organism because you don't know how much blood is being lost. So blood clotting, or the coagulation cascade, is another classic example of a positive feedback loop. Okay? There are some not so great ones clinically. So for example, there are cases of what we call runaway fever. You've probably heard of these cases, like pediatric cases of kids that, they get to a fever, it's 105, and it's not controlled. And so they put them in an ice bath, and the fever's starting to get out of control. They're on Tylenol, they're supplementing with ibuprofen around the clock, and the fever is not going down, it won't break. So runaway fever is a illness situation where the temperature regulation of the body is out of whack. And so that would be a deleterious example of a positive feedback loop. Make sense? All right. Lastly, in this particular lecture, then we're going to move straight into our next lecture, are some terms. You're going to be going over these terms this week in laboratory. Okay, so I want to use this opportunity to tell you how the class is structured. It is structured to be run somewhat in parallel, but it's not identical. So what you're going to cover in lab is going to track with what we're covering in lecture, but it won't be exactly lined up week by week. It can't be. So for example, there's a portion of the semester where you're going to spend, like 3 or 4 weeks in bones, and then 3 to 4 weeks in muscle. Well, we couldn't possibly, in a 200-level class, spend 3 or 4 weeks in muscle physiology. It would be way beyond the scope of this class. Okay? So lab really focuses on identification, location, structure, and then function. What does it do? In lecture, we're going to get into a lot of the mechanism, or a lot of the physiology of, well, how is it organized so that it gives rise to specific functions? What happens in sort of a disease state? What happens when something doesn't work? How does muscle contraction actually work? Not just it flexes. So it's going to be biceps brachii for arm flexion. We're going to look at what causes flexion. How does it work? Get down to the level of the muscle to see where does calcium come into play. So we're going to look down at the molecular level on the mechanistic pathways. All right, so if we take a look, though, for sake of completeness, we need to make sure that we're all on the same page with respect to anatomical position. And this is a key tenet for lab and lecture. And as you move on in your career, you're going to continue to need to think about it in this terminology. So if you see this individual in anatomical position, that looks like this. Right? So palms are facing up. Right? and they're down at your side. They're not like this, they're kind of like so. And your legs are usually about shoulder width apart, and you're looking forward, and your eyes are wide open. That's anatomical position. So if I present with a right femoral fracture, that is looking at my right femur, so it's on your left side. Does that make sense? So you're going to have a lot of times when you're reading this information in the literature, in the textbook, or on like clinical case studies, you're going to kind of doing one of these, like, is it, it's the patient's, it's always from the patient's perspective. Okay, so that in mind is really important. And you'll see that show up on exams, practicals, as well in lab, as well as examinations in this class. So that's what this means by left is right, right is left. It's referring to the patient's perspective. Then we have some different terms like supine and prone. Supine here is like holding a bowl of soup. And then prone would be pouring out the soup. So you kind of pour it out. Okay? Then we have ventral and dorsal. So ventral and dorsal really comes from quadrupeds, four-legged animals. And you can remember that by the dorsal fin on a shark. A lot of shark news this year. Shark information in the news this year, right? Did you guys see the surfing competition in South Africa? If you haven't, you need to YouTube this. This is nuts. There's two dudes that were in this surf competition off of South Africa. Just out, was it out of Cape Town, I think? Is that right? Cape Town? And there's this footage of this shark that comes up on this Australian surfer, who is one of the competitors. And it is basically right there, and this wave comes up, and you see him disappear. And then he reappears, and they called off the competition. But it is frightening how close he was. Right? Well, he gets like pulled down too, like the board goes under the water. I think the shark had his leash and dragged him under, and he punched the shark. I thought that was pretty cool. Right? I would have like gone, ah! You want to think that you would punch it, but we probably, guys, 70% of us probably would scream. Okay? So he punches the shark. Then the other thing that's really cool, this is totally off topic, but it's okay, is the other competitor who's, they have a respect for each other. What did he do? What do you think he did? Swam away, right? Good luck, He swam towards the guy. He went there because he saw that the board was missing. He's not going to last out here very long without his board. Because they were actually pretty big swells. So he swims, in the moment he swims towards, and they hug and high five, and everybody's fine, but it's a pretty cool story. You should actually YouTube it. It's quite spectacular. In fact, it's so scary that the announcers cuss online, on the air. They're like, oh my, right? They didn't have time to believe it. It's so awesome. It's so funny. Okay. It's only funny because nobody got hurt, okay? And the announcer, swear like a seventh grader. Okay, the dorsal fin. Okay, that's where we were. Something's shiny. So that's how you remember this. So hopefully you'll never forget it now. And then the ventral is the belly. So for us, we call it anterior and posterior. But this is where it came from originally, was from these animals. So we call it anterior and posterior. We won't use dorsal and ventral very often. You might, as you move on in your studies, especially if you do neurophysiology, because in a lot of neurobiology work, they're using lower level animals. And so they still refer to it as the dorsal aspect or the ventral aspect. But you're going to see some relics in this class of terminology, like when we get into the nervous system, we still refer to it as like the dorsal root horn and the ventral root horn, and that's where it came from. I wanted you guys to know why we do that. Why does it look like it's two words for the same thing? Superior and inferior. So superior is going to be basically up top of the head. So the head's superior to the feet. And the knees are inferior to the hips. And then medial and lateral. Medial is towards the midline, and lateral is away from the midline. So if I'm in anatomical position, right, like this, with my hands out slightly, then my shoulder is actually medial to my hand. Does that make sense? Because you're supposed to be out a little bit like so. You guys catch that? Okay. So medial and lateral. I know this is pretty rudimentary, but it's important. A lot of students struggle with this. So if you don't go over it, you won't have a frame of reference. Proximal and distal. So proximal is closer to the center, and distal is further away. So like in anatomical position, the hands are distal from the shoulders. Okay? So you can see that there might be two different ways to refer to anatomical positions. Superficial and deep. So superficial is going to be towards the surface, like the skin. And deep is going to be within the body, like where the muscles are, or the blood vessels, or the bones. The bones are going to be deep to the skin. We have different anatomical planes. And if you're in lab, there are, hopefully your instructors talked about these online activities for lab. The lab itself has these online activities, and because we wrote it ourselves, you don't have to buy a code. That's kind of nice. And there actually are some really good online activities in the lab manual to be able to practice these different planes of section. So sagittal. Sagittal is going to divide the body into right and left sides. And there's a special case where it's mid-sagittal, where it divides it essentially two equal halves. Parasagittal is basically any other sagittal section that's not on the midline. Okay, but they're all considered sagittal sections. All right, and then frontal. Frontal is going to come down and divide the body into an anterior and a posterior aspect. Frontal. Another name for it in some textbooks is coronal, a coronal section. And then the last one is transverse. That divides the body into a superior and an inferior aspect. Another word in some textbooks of transverse is a horizontal plane. It comes like this. So how many of you had a CAT scan? So in a CAT scan, you're using imaging technology to take transverse planes through the body, and then you reconstruct it in the Z direction. And then you can scroll through it. Okay? You could also do it in any other one of these planes, but most oftentimes it's in the transverse plane. And then body cavities. So the dorsal body cavity is towards the back, right, the posterior aspect, and it's going to house the cranial cavity and the vertebral cavity. Cranial cavity has basically the cranium, the brain. The vertebral body, or the vertebral cavity, houses the vertebral column and all of the spinal cord and every other aspect that's associated with that part of the central nervous system. The ventral body cavity is towards the front aspect, or the anterior aspect. And the diaphragm is going to divide the ventral body cavity into the thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavities. So the thoracic is further subdivided via the mediastinum from the right and the left side. Where this is important is in what we call a pneumothorax. How many of you are familiar with a pneumothorax? How many have had one? No one's had one? Wow. That's usually pretty common in a class this size, so at least have one person. So a pneumothorax is where you have the thoracic cavity impaled, either by an auto accident, or it could be a wound, it could be trauma, like a knife stabbing, or a gunshot wound, and the pleural pressure now equilibrates with the atmospheric pressure. So what happens a lot of times is that lung on that side will collapse, and the patient can't breathe out of that lung. But because there's a mediastinum, it only affects one side and not the other. Okay? If you were a buffalo, that would not be the case. They don't have a mediastinum. And that's why when man was hunting buffalo with spears, right, they could bring down a large buffalo with just one impalement to the side of the animal. Because as soon as they put it through, the whole thoracic cavity and the lungs would go like that, and then the animal would just drop. Okay? So we're better than buffalo. Remember that. Pays to be at the top of the food chain. That's what I tell my girls every time I kill a bug. They're like, "Oh, Dad, it's a bug. Come get it." And I'll squash it. Like, "Oh, why'd you kill it?" I'm like, pays to be at the top of the food chain. But I mean, really, they're calling for me to kill the bug, or get rid of the bug, kill it, and now they're upset with me. What kinds of membranes line cavities? So we have meningeal tissue. Meninges line the brain and the spinal cord. We're going to talk more about these special linings throughout the semester. And then we have other cavities that are lined by what we call serous membranes. And this is where there's no opening to the outside environment. So the best two examples here are going to be within the thoracic cavity and the abdominal pelvic cavity. And a lot of times what you see with a serous membrane is you have an inner layer and an outer layer. The inner layer is the visceral layer, the outer layer is the parietal layer. And you have fluid in between them. Why do you think you have two layers with fluid in between? Decreased friction. Okay? And the fluid is a lubricious type of fluid. Say that word with me. Lubricious. That's a fun word. Lubricious. I want you to use that this weekend. One time. Lubricious. Okay? Try it. I'm going to ask you on Tuesday. So you have this lubricious fluid that kind of acts like oil or grease. And it allows those membranes to slide across each other so that there isn't any friction. If there was friction, you'd have one of two things happening. You'd get inflammation taking place, or you would get adhesion. Okay, and so there are disease states where that fluid is compromised, or there's too much of it, or too little, and you get an irritation of that lining, and it causes an endocarditis. Okay? So, this fluid interface, you see, you can kind of evaluate it like this. If you took a halfway inflated balloon and put your fist into it, you would kind of create a double membrane, but instead of liquid in here, you have air. So imagine that that would be comparable to where the fluid would be in this double membrane interface. You see that around the heart, and you see that around the lungs. Because that makes sense, right? We have the heart beating, and as the heart beats, it rubs up against that parietal space, and that friction needs to be frictionless as much as possible. And in the lungs as well, is you actually want to expand and retract multiple times a minute throughout the day, and so you want that to be basically frictionless. Now we have other types of membrane cavities that open to the outside, and they're called mucous membranes. So the mouth, right, the nose, the eyes, the anus, the vagina, all of these would be mucous membranes that open to the outside environment. Questions? So we're going to pause here. I'm just going to switch the slides.